Family dinners hold secrets, deep, dark things that simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. That night, the laughter faded and cold silence took its place. Faces I once trusted twisted into something unrecognizable, and the walls echoed with words that cut deeper than any knife. Everything I held onto shattered in an instant, and the truth revealed itself in the most brutal way. This story isn't just about betrayal or money. It's about what happens when love turns complicated, when loyalty breaks, and when the line between family and stranger blurs. If you want to see how it all spirals out of control and what's left when the dust settles, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from the comments. This journey will grip you and haunt you long after it ends. That night at my daughter's house had all the appearances of a pleasant celebration, but I could sense from the moment I stepped through the door that something was off. The table, a solid mahogany piece I had personally helped them select and pay for just last year, gleamed under the warm chandelier light. Crystal wine glasses were perfectly aligned beside polished silverware, and the scent of roasted prime rib drifted through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of rosemary and garlic from the side dishes. Lorraine, my daughter, had gone out of her way to make this night special in honor of her husband Curtis's promotion to regional sales manager. Yet beneath her polite hostess smile, I caught fleeting glances of tension. I took my usual place near the center of the table, a spot that once felt like a position of respect, but lately had seemed more like a formality. Curtis, predictably, had claimed the head of the table, his posture commanding and his smirk barely concealed. He thrived in moments where he could be the center of attention, and this promotion had inflated his ego even further. After a few minutes of small talk and polite laughter, Curtis leaned back in his chair, swirling the Cabernet in his glass, a bottle I had brought as a congratulatory gift, and said, "So, Graham, retirement must be nice. No pressure, no deadlines, no real responsibilities." The words were delivered casually, but the glint in his eye told me they were meant as more than idle conversation. I set down my fork, taking a moment before answering. "It has its moments," I said, keeping my tone light but neutral. Lorraine glanced at me quickly, as though silently urging me to let the comment slide. But Curtis pressed on. "Don't get me wrong," he said with a chuckle. "You had a decent run as an engineer, but that was 40 years ago? The world's moved on. Everything's digital now, fast-paced. It takes a sharper, younger mind to really succeed these days." My granddaughter Anna, who had been quietly cutting into her dinner, suddenly spoke up. "Grandpa built me a treehouse last summer," she said, her voice full of pride. Curtis patted her head, his smile patronizing. "That's sweet, honey, but real men provide for their families through their own hard work. Building tree houses is cute, but it's not the same." The jab was clear, and Lorraine's forced laugh did little to break the growing tension. "Maybe we should talk about something else," she said quickly. "Anna, why don't you tell Grandpa about your piano recital?" Curtis ignored her attempt to steer the conversation. "Actually," he said, taking another drink, "now that I'm bringing in real money, I think it's time for everyone to start pulling their own weight." My grip on my knife tightened slightly. I knew exactly what he was implying. For the past 15 years, since Lorna passed away, I had quietly covered their mortgage, car payments, private school tuition, medical bills, and even their vacations. I had never thrown it in their faces, never demanded repayment. I did it because I wanted my daughter and her family to live comfortably. Yet here was this man lecturing me about pulling my weight. "Take Lorraine, for example," he continued. "She's been out of the workforce for years, living off what we might call family charity." Lorraine's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. My grandson Tyler set his fork down, sensing the shift in the room. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" he asked quietly. Lorraine shook her head, but her voice wavered when she said, "No, honey, everything's fine." Curtis wasn't finished. It's important for kids to understand the difference between earners and dependents, between providers and those who've just given up. He looked directly at me as he spoke, his smile full of smug satisfaction. "When was the last time you did something meaningful, Graham? When did you last earn your keep instead of just existing?" Lorraine reached for his arm. "Curtis, please." But he held up a hand, silencing her, and delivered the line that tipped the scales completely. "How does it feel to be a loser?" For a moment, the room was utterly still. The only sounds were the faint crackle of the candles and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Anna stared at him with wide eyes, while Tyler looked back and forth between us like he was watching a slow-motion car crash. Lorraine covered her mouth, horrified. I didn't flinch. I took a slow sip of water, set the glass down deliberately, and met his gaze without blinking. "How does it feel?" I said evenly, "to know that this loser will no longer be paying your bills?" The color drained from his face instantly, replaced by a flicker of something I had never seen in him before: uncertainty. Lorraine's hand fell away from her mouth, her lips parting in shock. My shoes made a soft thud on the carpet as I stepped inside and closed the door, shutting out the rest of the house. The air in here smelled faintly of paper and cedar from the old wooden desk that had been my work companion for decades. Against the far wall stood the file cabinet I had bought in the early 80s, back when record-keeping was as important to me as the engineering projects I designed. I knelt in front of the cabinet, feeling the cool metal handle under my fingers, and opened the top drawer. Each folder was neatly labeled in my handwriting, organized not just by year, but by category. Blue for mortgage payments, green for car payments, yellow for tuition, red for medical expenses, white for utilities, and miscellaneous living costs. I pulled them out one by one, stacking them carefully on the desk, and began flipping through the documents. The numbers told a story more honest than any conversation could. Mortgage, $2,800 a month for 15 years. I pulled out a calculator, but even before I punched in the numbers, I could do the math in my head. Over $500,000 just to keep their roof over their heads. Next came the car payments. Curtis had insisted on a BMW 3 years ago, and before that, a luxury SUV Lorraine claimed was necessary for the kids. Those ran me about $200 a month over several years, plus down payments that were conveniently forgotten when they talked about their self-made status. Tuition was next. Grace and Tyler attended a private school that Lorraine swore would give them the best start in life. That was $24,000 a year, every year, and I had paid it without hesitation. The red folders contained the medical bills, $8,000 a year for family insurance coverage, plus additional costs for emergencies, checkups, and the occasional surgery. And then there were the extras: vacations to Europe, the kitchen remodel Lorraine couldn't live without, the backyard deck Curtis wanted for his barbecues. Altogether, the totals reached a staggering $976,200. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the neat columns of figures I'd just written down on a yellow legal pad. That number didn't just represent money. It represented years of choices, sacrifices, and a promise I had made to Lorna on her deathbed. I could still see her lying there in the hospital room, the steady beep of the heart monitor keeping time with her shallow breaths. She had gripped my hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll take care of Lorraine. Make sure she's okay, even if I'm not here." I had nodded without hesitation, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle on my shoulders. And for 15 years, I had honored it without question. But Lorna had never meant for that promise to become a crutch for Lorraine and her family. She had envisioned support during difficult times, not an endless subsidy for a lifestyle they could never sustain on their own. As I sat there in the quiet, the events of the evening replayed in my mind. Curtis's smug grin, his condescending tone, the way Lorraine looked away as he insulted me. And then my own voice, calm and deliberate, telling him I would no longer be paying their bills. I realized that tonight hadn't been an impulsive decision. It had been years in the making. I simply hadn't admitted it to myself until Curtis's arrogance tore away the last bit of patience I had. I gathered the folders and slid them back into the cabinet, locking the drawer with a decisive click. Then I reached for the phone on my desk and began writing a list. On it were every account, every automatic payment, every bank draft I had set up for them over the years. Mortgage company, car loan servicer, private school billing office, insurance provider, credit card accounts. As the list grew, so did my resolve. This wasn't about revenge. This was about drawing a line. If they wanted to keep their house, their cars, their vacations, and their private school tuition, they would have to find a way to pay for it themselves. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. There was no going back now. The words I had spoken at dinner had been the spark, but what I was about to do next would be the fire. The list I had written the night before sat on my desk like a battle plan. I took a deep breath and picked up the phone. The first call was to the mortgage company. After verifying my identity, I told them I would no longer be making payments on the account for 315 Westfield Avenue. The woman on the other end hesitated, probably not used to hearing someone cut off payments without a fight. She reminded me of the due dates, the late fees, the possible foreclosure process, but I told her plainly, it's not my house, and it's not my responsibility anymore. I crossed mortgage off the list. Next was the car loan office. Curtis's BMW was the first target. When I told the representative to remove my name and stop the payments, he asked if I wanted to arrange a payoff. No, I said, that's for the owner to handle now. Lorraine's SUV was next, and I gave the same instruction. Both accounts were closed from my end within 20 minutes. I moved on to the private school. The tuition for Grace and Tyler had always been billed directly to me, with Lorraine promising to send something toward it every few months, which almost never happened. I told the school administrator that I would no longer be responsible for tuition. She asked if I wanted to speak to Lorraine first, but I refused. They'll find out soon enough, I said. Insurance was next, health, dental, vision. For years, they had been covered under my plan as dependents, which cost me thousands annually. I called the provider and instructed them to remove every non-dependent from my policy effective immediately. The representative warned me that once removed, re-enrollment could be difficult. That's fine, I replied. They can find their own plan. Utilities followed. I had set up accounts for their water, gas, and electricity when they first bought the house, thinking it would be temporary help. Somehow, my name had stayed on every account for over a decade. I called each company and told them to transfer full responsibility to the current residents. Finally, I addressed the credit cards. I had been paying off a joint card for emergencies that had become a catch-all for vacations, electronics, and dinners out. I called the issuer, removed myself from the account, and told them to forward the remaining balance to Curtis and Lorraine. By the time I put the phone down, it was just afternoon. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I felt a strange sense of warmth in my chest. The safety net was gone, and for the first time in 15 years, their financial survival depended entirely on their own efforts. Not long after, my phone rang. It was Lorraine. Dad, the bank just called. They said the mortgage payment didn't go through. Her voice was strained, carrying the edge of panic. That's right, I said calmly, because I didn't make it. There was a pause on the line, then, what do you mean you didn't make it? You've always. I cut her off. Not anymore. It's time you and Curtis handle your own bills. Before she could respond, another call buzzed through. I switched lines. It was Curtis. His voice was sharper, more aggressive. "You're making a big mistake, old man. You think you can just pull the rug out from under us because of one conversation?" I didn't raise my voice. It wasn't one conversation. It was 15 years of one-sided giving. Now it's over. He tried to intimidate me, talking about how I'd be hurting the kids, but I reminded him that I had already arranged to cover Grace and Tyler's basic needs directly: school lunches, clothes, medical checkups, but anything beyond that was up to them. His tone shifted, but only slightly, from anger to disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," I said, and hung up. The rest of the afternoon was quiet, almost too quiet. I imagined them scrambling, checking their accounts, realizing the gravity of what I had done. I didn't feel guilt, only a sense of inevitability. This was the point we were always heading toward, whether I admitted it or not. By evening, Lorraine called again, her voice quieter, more hesitant. "Dad, can we talk about this? Maybe over dinner?" I knew it was an attempt to soften me, but I also knew any dinner would turn into another scene like last night. "There's nothing to discuss," I told her. It began subtly, a lingering glance from Mrs. Ellsworth, my neighbor across the street, as she collected her mail, and a hesitant wave from Mr. Turner, who usually greeted me with his usual cheerful morning, Graham, but now offered only a tight nod before retreating indoors. By midday, the phone began to ring again, not with calls from Curtis or Lorraine this time, but from acquaintances and old friends whose voices carried the careful tone of people who didn't want to seem like they were prying but couldn't help themselves. "I heard there's trouble between you and Lorraine's family," one of them began, pausing as though waiting for me to either confirm or deny. I told them the truth without embellishment. For 15 years, I had covered nearly every major expense for my daughter's household, spending almost $1 million to keep them living in comfort, and now I had decided to stop. Some callers murmured understanding. Others made vague noises of sympathy, but a few responded with a stunned, "I had no idea." Curtis, however, had no interest in letting my version of events spread quietly. According to what I heard later, he wasted no time planting his own narrative. At the bar he frequented with his coworkers, he claimed that I had cut off the family because I couldn't stand seeing someone else in the spotlight. He told them I was petty, jealous, and bitter, and that I had no regard for the welfare of my grandchildren. At the local grocery store, he confided to anyone willing to listen that my actions were part of some long-standing resentment toward him personally, painting himself as a hard-working man whose success had somehow offended me. What he didn't know was that small towns have a way of chewing up lies and spitting out the truth faster than people expect. It only took a couple of conversations before the cracks in his story began to show. One of his drinking buddies happened to know a salesman at the car dealership where Curtis had gotten his BMW, and when that salesman mentioned casually that I had been the one to co-sign the loan and pay every monthly installment, the self-made image Curtis liked to project started to crumble. Meanwhile, Lorraine was more cautious in her approach. Instead of public rants, she tried the route of quiet sympathy-seeking, telling friends that she didn't know why her father had suddenly turned cold. But when a mutual acquaintance reminded her that suddenly didn't usually mean 15 years of steady financial support, her narrative faltered. The ripple effect reached my church community by the end of the week. After Sunday service, a few members approached me in the fellowship hall, their voices low but direct. "Curtis says you're not helping with the kids anymore," one woman said. "Is that true?" I explained, as I had to others, that I had not stopped helping my grandchildren. I was still committed to their needs, but I had ended the practice of subsidizing their parents' luxury lifestyle. To my mild surprise, several people responded with nods of approval, some even sharing stories of their own about adult children who had grown too comfortable on someone else's dime. I didn't go looking for sympathy, but I didn't shy away from the truth either. If someone asked, I gave them the numbers. $2,800 a month for their mortgage, $200 for each car, $24,000 annually for private school tuition, $8,000 for medical insurance, plus untold amounts for vacations, home renovations, and credit card balances. The figures spoke for themselves, and once people heard them, the narrative began to shift. Even those who had initially been skeptical started to see the situation for what it was. Curtis must have realized the tide was turning because by the end of that second week, his public comments became less frequent, though his glare across the room at the bar, as reported by a friend, suggested his resentment was far from fading. Lorraine stopped calling altogether, perhaps out of embarrassment, perhaps because she knew I wouldn't budge. The kids, however, were caught in the middle. Grace sent me a short text one evening. "Hi, Grandpa. I miss you." I replied immediately, telling her she was welcome to visit any time. Tyler's message came a day later. "Dad's mad, but Mom says you still care about us." I assured him that nothing had changed between us, and that my decision was about their parents, not them. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing thought that they were absorbing more of the tension than they should have to. In the meantime, the bills I had once handled for Lorraine and Curtis began to pile up. The mortgage company sent notices, the private school issued reminders, and the car loan office reached out about missed payments. None of this surprised me. I had known from the moment I hung up the phone with those companies that the adjustment would be swift and brutal. I also knew that each notice, each overdue statement, would chip away at the illusion Curtis had been maintaining about their financial independence. But as I turned my head, my eyes caught the sight of a large, neon orange foreclosure notice taped to their front door, visible even from halfway down the block. It wasn't subtle, and it certainly wasn't the kind of thing Curtis could spin into a victory. I slowed my truck enough to take in the scene. The perfectly trimmed lawn now littered with a few stray leaves, the driveway conspicuously missing the gleaming black BMW he had once been so proud of, and in its place a weathered, faded Honda Civic that looked at least 15 years old. For a man like Curtis, whose self-worth seemed tied to appearances, that downgrade alone must have been a daily humiliation. I didn't stop or gawk. I simply kept driving, knowing full well that any sympathy I might have offered would have been twisted into another tool for him to use against me. Later that afternoon, while I was repairing a loose hinge on my back gate, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Tyler's name. I answered, and his voice came through in a whisper, the way children speak when they don't want to be overheard. "Grandpa, Mom, and Dad are fighting a lot," he said. "Like every night." I could hear the faint murmur of voices in the background, low but tense, and the occasional sharp word cutting through. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Money," Tyler replied, almost reluctantly. "Mom said the bank might take the house. Dad said it's your fault, but I think maybe it's because they don't have enough." His innocence in stating the obvious was heartbreaking. I told him gently that grown-ups sometimes made mistakes about money and that none of it was his fault. I reminded him that he and Grace could always call or visit me if they needed to. After we hung up, I sat for a long time on the back porch, staring at the fading light. The consequences were arriving right on schedule, not because I wished hardship on them, but because I had been propping up a structure that was unsustainable from start. Without my support, their spending habits were colliding head-on with reality. A couple of days later, I stopped into the local supermarket to pick up a few things. As I turned down the checkout lanes, I froze for a moment. There was Lorraine, standing behind a register in the store's red polo shirt, scanning items for a customer I recognized from church. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and there was a weariness in her posture that I hadn't seen before. She looked up briefly and spotted me. For a split second, her expression flickered between embarrassment and something else. Maybe resentment, maybe shame. She didn't wave, and I didn't either. We simply acknowledged each other with a brief nod before she returned to her work. I paid for my groceries at a different lane, but I couldn't help glancing back as I left. There is something surreal about seeing my daughter, who had once thrown garden parties and hosted holiday dinners, now bagging groceries for the same people who used to compliment her on her home decor. Word of her new job traveled quickly in town, and while some people expressed sympathy, others remarked that it was about time she contributed financially. Curtis, from what I gathered, had not taken any such step toward employment beyond his existing job. Instead, he seemed to double down on his bitterness, avoiding places where he might run into me and lashing out at anyone who questioned his version of events. The BMW's absence was a point of speculation among his friends, with some guessing it had been repossessed and others assuming he had sold it to cover bills. I didn't have to guess. I knew for certain that without my payments, keeping a luxury car was impossible for them. Meanwhile, the foreclosure process on the house was moving forward. Notices were being mailed, calls from the bank were increasing, and Curtis and Lorraine were running out of options. Tyler's occasional texts grew shorter, often just a simple hi or how are you, while Grace's messages carried a more wistful tone, telling me about school projects or soccer practice as though she were trying to hold on to something normal. I answered every message, careful not to say anything that would make them feel caught between their parents and me. It was hard, though, not to think about the emotional strain they were under. Each time I passed their street, I noticed small changes, the flower beds going untended, the blinds drawn more often, the air of pride that had once surrounded their home slowly evaporating. Friends who lived nearby told me that the arguments inside could sometimes be heard from the sidewalk. I didn't take any joy in hearing that. My decision to cut them off had never been about punishing the kids, and seeing them caught in the crossfire was the one part of this I couldn't stomach easily. Still, I knew reversing course now would undo everything. If I stepped in to save them at this stage, they'd learn nothing, and in another year or two, we'd be right back where we started. By the end of that week, I received a call from a mutual acquaintance who worked at the bank. When I opened the door, Miles stood there, though in my case, it was Curtis, stripped of the polished suit and smug demeanor, wearing a soaked hoodie and jeans, his hair plastered to his forehead. For a moment, he didn't speak, just stood there dripping water onto the welcome mat, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he was fighting against admitting what he'd come to say. "Can I come in?" he asked finally, and his voice lacked the sharpness it usually carried. I stepped aside, motioning toward the living room. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped together, staring down at the floor. "We can't make it," he said after a long pause. "Without your help, we're sinking fast. Is there a way to fix this?" His words didn't surprise me, though the humility in his tone was new. For a moment, I simply watched him, weighing whether this was genuine or just another performance. "You've had 15 years to learn to stand on your own," I said finally. "You never took the chance." He flinched at that, then sighed. "I know. I was wrong. I thought we could handle it, but I guess I was wrong about a lot of things." I didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between us until he shifted uncomfortably. Eventually, he left without a commitment from me, though I could tell from his expression he had hoped for a different outcome. The next afternoon, the rain still hadn't let up, and I found myself in the kitchen making coffee when another knock came. This time, it was Lorraine, or Jude in the original script, standing in the doorway, her umbrella barely shielding her from the downpour. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, her hands gripping the strap of her purse as if holding onto something solid. "Dad," she began, her voice wavering, "I'm not here to argue. I just need you to know the kids are struggling. Tyler's grades are slipping. Grace hasn't been herself. I don't care about the cars or the house, but can you at least help keep their lives stable?" I studied her for a long moment. Unlike Curtis, she wasn't here to defend herself or make excuses. She was here for the kids, and I believed her sincerity. "I'm willing to make sure they have what they need," I said finally, "but not one penny will go toward propping up your lifestyle. No mortgage, no car payments, no vacations. If you want that, you'll have to earn it." Her eyes softened with a mix of relief and regret. "I understand," she said. "Just thank you for doing that much." I told her I'd set up direct payments for the children's tuition, healthcare, clothing, and activities, but the rest would be up to them. She agreed without hesitation, and I couldn't help thinking how different her response was from Curtis's. That evening, I drafted a clear plan. I would handle the kids' essentials directly, paying the school, doctors, and stores myself, and keep receipts for every transaction. There would be no cash handouts, no check for Curtis to redirect. This wasn't charity, it was targeted support for my grandchildren. The following day, I received a text from Lorraine thanking me again, followed almost immediately by a call from Curtis. His voice was cold. "So you're willing to help her, but not me?" I reminded him that this wasn't about sides, it was about priorities, and my priority was the kids. "If you want to be treated differently, then start acting like a father who can provide for his family without leaning on someone else's wallet," I said. And before he could respond, I ended the call. Over the next week, I followed through on my commitment. I called Grace's school to arrange payment for the next semester, spoke with Tyler's soccer coach to cover his team fees, and updated the children's medical insurance under a plan in my name alone. I also set aside a modest college fund for each of them, something they wouldn't know about until they were older, but which gave me peace of mind that their futures wouldn't be entirely at the mercy of their parents' decisions. During this time, the foreclosure process on the house didn't slow down, and the stress between Curtis and Lorraine seemed to intensify. Tyler called me one evening to say his dad was angry that I'd gone behind his back to handle the kids' needs directly. I explained gently that I wasn't going behind anyone's back. I was going around the problem to protect him and his sister. "I guess that makes sense," he said quietly before hanging up. Curtis didn't come by again after that first visit, but I heard from others in town that his pride had taken a significant hit. No more boasting about his salary or his cars. Those days were gone. Instead, he kept a lower profile, avoiding public places where he might have to answer uncomfortable questions about the sudden changes in their life. I didn't have to ask what they needed a break from. The answer was written between the lines. "Of course," I said, and by 6 o'clock, their knock echoed at my door. Grace came in first, lugging her backpack and a tote bag that looked far too full for just a couple of nights. Tyler followed, his eyes lighting up when he saw the familiar chessboard set up on the coffee table. "We brought our homework," Grace announced, "but Mom said we could do fun stuff too." I smiled and told them we'd figure it out as we went. That evening, I cooked a simple dinner, baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, and the three of us ate at the kitchen table while talking about their week. Grace told me about a science project involving building a small wind turbine, while Tyler recounted a soccer match where he'd scored the winning goal. There was laughter, teasing, and not a single tense silence, and I realized how rare that must have been for them lately. After dinner, we cleared the table together, then spent the rest of the night playing chess and watching an old comedy I'd recorded years ago. When bedtime came, they didn't protest. They each claimed a guest room upstairs and fell asleep quickly, the sound of the rain outside acting like a lullaby. The next morning, they were already at the kitchen counter when I came down, working on their homework side by side. Grace was bent over her math problems, while Tyler wrote an essay for English. I made pancakes and bacon, and they both lit up as the smell filled the air. Over breakfast, Grace asked if we could start cooking dinners together like a real restaurant, and Tyler suggested we work on fixing up the old treehouse in my backyard. I agreed to both, and we spent the rest of Saturday splitting our time between the kitchen and the yard. By Sunday evening, neither seemed eager to go home. Lorraine arrived to pick them up, offer me a grateful smile as they hug me goodbye. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly. They needed this. The weekends turned into a pattern. Sometimes it was every other week, sometimes more often, depending on how bad things were at home. Curtis's resentment was palpable. I could see in the way he avoided eye contact when dropping the kids off or picking them up. Tyler told me once in a hushed voice that his dad didn't like how much fun they had here, as if enjoying time with their grandfather somehow undermined him. But Lorraine never discouraged their visits. If anything, she seemed relieved to have them out of the line of fire during the more heated arguments with Curtis. During one of those weekends, Grace confided in me while we were making spaghetti for dinner. "It's just, when we're at your house, it feels normal," she said, carefully twirling pasta around her fork. "At home, even when they're not yelling, it's like everyone's holding their breath." Tyler nodded in agreement, and I felt a quiet determination to make my home that safe place for them, no matter what happened with their parents. I started organizing small projects and activities for their visits. We built birdhouses, planted a vegetable garden, and even worked on repainting the treehouse a bright green. The pride in their faces when they saw the finished work was worth every splinter and smear of paint. School nights became part of the arrangement too on occasion, especially when Lorraine had late shifts. I'd pick them up from school, we'd do homework at the kitchen table, then cook dinner together. Those nights often ended with us reading in the living room or playing cards until bedtime. The more time they spent here, the more comfortable they became, and I noticed subtle changes. Tyler spoke more openly, Grace laughed more freely, and the constant edge of anxiety I'd seen in them seemed to fade. Curtis's irritation, however, only grew. One Friday, when he came to drop them off, he stood at the door a little too long. "Enjoy playing, Dad," he said with a bitter smile, "since you think you can do it better." I didn't take the bait. "I'm just being a grandfather," I replied evenly, and giving them a place where they can breathe. He muttered something under his breath as he turned to leave, but I let it go. Lorraine, in contrast, began to confide more in me during drop-offs and pickups. She told me she was looking for a second job, possibly in an office, to help cover expenses. She didn't ask for money beyond what I was already doing for the kids, and I respected her for that. "I don't want to lean on you any more than I have to," she said one afternoon, "but I'm grateful for what you're doing for them." I assured her she didn't owe me gratitude for taking care of my grandchildren. The clock was ticking. The bank's foreclosure notice was real, and the $8,625 needed to stop it from proceeding was due within days. I had arranged a final mortgage payment to stave off the immediate threat, but I made it clear this would be the last time. When Lorraine arrived at my door that afternoon with the kids, their faces drawn but hopeful, I invited them inside with a calm I hoped would steady the storm. The room was familiar, our family living room, the place where countless holidays, birthdays, and ordinary days have been shared. But this conversation was anything but ordinary. I began by laying out the financial reality as plainly as I could. I explained the payments I would continue to make: tuition directly to the private school, medical bills, clothing, sports fees, music lessons, and the establishment of college fund for both Grace and Tyler. I emphasized that these contributions were for the children's futures, not for adult comforts or lifestyle. Lorraine listened quietly, her eyes never leaving mine, while Curtis shifted uneasily in the corner, arms crossed and jaw clenched. Then I delivered the conditions that I knew would be the hardest for them to swallow. No more payments toward the mortgage, the cars, home insurance, or any expenses tied to their lifestyle. They would have to live within their actual means, downsize if necessary, and prioritize necessities over luxuries. More than that, I demanded public acknowledgement of the nearly $1 million I had contributed over 15 years. A letter to the community newspaper, honest posts on social media expressing genuine gratitude, and face-to-face apologies to neighbors they had misled. It was not a demand for humiliation, but for honesty, respect, and an end to the entitlement that had poisoned their attitudes. Lorraine's face tightened, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Curtis, for all his bluster, looked like a man hearing an ultimatum he could not refuse. I saw in their eyes a mixture of fear, resentment, and perhaps a faint glimmer of understanding. I told them that this offer was time-sensitive. They had 48 hours to decide. After that, the opportunity would expire, and I would step back completely. Lorraine was the first to speak, her voice trembling yet resolute. "Dad, I don't know if I can convince Curtis to agree to all of this." I nodded slowly. Then maybe he needs to learn what it truly means to face the consequences of his choices. The children, who had been quiet until now, looked between their parents and me with uncertainty. Grace reached out and took my hand, her small fingers warm and trusting. I squeezed back, feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. Over the next 2 days, the house was tense, filled with hushed arguments and tearful confessions. Lorraine confided in me one evening that Curtis was struggling with pride, unwilling to admit publicly that he had depended on my support for so long. "It's like his whole identity is wrapped up in pretending he's made it on his own," she said. "But this is the only way forward." I reminded her that pride was no substitute for honesty and that rebuilding trust required humility. When the 48-hour deadline arrived, Lorraine returned to my house with Curtis in tow, their demeanor subdued. Curtis stepped forward first, clearing his throat, and then spoke haltingly but sincerely about the mistakes he had made and the debt he owed me, not just in money but in respect and gratitude. Lorraine echoed his sentiments, promising to make the public acknowledgments and apologize to those they had misled. I felt a surge of relief and cautious hope as I outlined the plans for the monthly family meetings we would hold to keep communication open and ensure accountability. The children smiled, and for the first time in a long while, the room felt like a family again. The transformation in their demeanor was unmistakable. Lorraine's posture was straighter, her eyes more focused, and Curtis, who once had seemed almost permanently defensive, now wore a tentative but genuine respect in his gaze. Grace bounced ahead, her soccer uniform grass-stained but proudly worn, while Tyler clutched a stack of papers and a report card with straight A's. As I opened the door and welcomed them in, I could feel a quiet but powerful sense of hope in the air, one that had been missing for far too long. We settled into the living room where the walls, lined with photos of past family milestones, seemed to watch over us with quiet approval. Lorraine began by placing a manila folder on the coffee table, labeled Monthly Budget Review. Inside were carefully organized statements, receipts, and notes, a level of financial transparency that was unheard of just a few months ago. "Dad," she began, "here's this month's breakdown. We covered the mortgage, utilities, groceries, and the car payment entirely from our combined salaries." Curtis nodded, adding, "We even managed to start a small emergency fund. It's tight, but we're learning." I leaned forward, studying the papers with a sense of pride. This was the first time I saw true accountability, a willingness to face realities instead of pretending all was well. Grace spoke up next, eager and bright-eyed. "Grandpa, we won the soccer tournament. I scored the winning goal." She pulled out her medal, and Tyler chimed in, and I got a note from my teacher praising my attitude and grades. The room filled with laughter and warmth as the children shared their achievements, moments that have been overshadowed by financial stress and parental conflicts for far too long. Curtis, now seated with an ease I hadn't seen in years, asked quietly, "Mark, I wanted to ask your advice about a potential promotion opportunity at work. It would mean more responsibility, better salary, but also travel. I want to make sure Lorraine and I can handle the kids' schedules if I'm away. I smiled, feeling the weight of that question, a symbol of hope and the challenges that come with growth. We discussed options, calendars, and contingency plans. And for the first time, Curtis approached the future with cautious optimism rather than anxiety. Lorraine shared updates about her new role as shift supervisor at the grocery store, how she was learning to balance work and family in ways that were previously unimaginable. The children's school and extracurricular activities were now a coordinated effort, and we all agreed that open communication would be the foundation moving forward. Over the next hour, the conversation shifted from finances to family memories, laughter punctuating the room as old stories were revisited and new ones began to take shape. At one point, Grace pulled out handmade thank you cards that she and Tyler had made for me, decorated with glitter and heartfelt messages. Thank you for taking care of us. Even when Mom and Dad forgot to say please, one read. Another simply said, I love you, Grandpa. You're the best. Those words cut through the years of pain and disappointment, reminding me why I had fought so hard for this family. The children's innocence and gratitude rekindled something in all of us, a desire to heal and rebuild. That night, as they left and I walked them to the car, the Honda that had replaced the BMW seemed less like a downgrade and more like a choice made with wisdom. Watching their taillights disappear down the street, I realized that Lorna would have been proud not for the money I'd spent or the control I'd exerted, but for the family we were becoming, one built on respect, honesty, and love. The battle was far from over, but this meeting marked a turning point. The golden light of early evening painted long shadows across the quiet street as Grace and Tyler, smiling and full of energy, held my hands on our walk to the old Honda parked in the driveway. The worn vehicle, once a symbol of loss and diminished status, now felt like a humble chariot carrying us forward, a testament to the choices we had made and the path we were building together. As we reached the car, Grace turned to me, her eyes bright and earnest, and asked, Grandpa, are you proud of us now? The question struck me deeply because it encapsulated everything I had hoped to achieve through years of sacrifice, confrontation, and difficult decisions. I looked down at her and then at Tyler, who nodded expectantly and smiled genuinely. Yes, I am very proud of both of you, I replied, my voice steady with warmth and conviction. It wasn't pride rooted in the money I had given or the comforts I had provided. It was pride born from witnessing their growth, resilience, and understanding of what it truly means to earn respect and love. Over the past months, the family had transformed in ways that no dollar amount could measure. Lorraine, now more confident and independent, juggled her supervisory job and family duties with grace. Curtis, once consumed by pride and denial, had begun to rebuild himself, not just financially, but emotionally and morally. The children thrived in this new environment of honesty and accountability, their laughter ringing through the rooms where tension once ruled. That evening, as I closed the car door and watched them drive away down the street, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. I thought of Lorna, my late wife, whose vision of family had been the compass guiding every step I took. She would have seen this moment, not as an end, but as a beginning. I realized that the justice I had sought all along was not about punishment or revenge, but about transformation. The sweetest justice is the kind that rebuilds broken bonds, restores dignity, and fosters genuine love. I walked back into the house, the familiar creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet grounding me in the present. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty or heavy with unspoken resentments. Instead, it held the promise of healing and hope. In the weeks that followed, The monthly family dinners became a cherished tradition, a space for laughter, shared challenges, and mutual support. There were still hard conversations, moments of frustration, and setbacks, but the foundation was different now. Respect had replaced entitlement, gratitude had replaced bitterness, and love had replaced exploitation. Reflecting on this journey, I understood that the greatest gift I could give my family was not financial aid, but the opportunity to grow up, to face consequences, and to learn the value of self reliance. It was a lesson I wish they had learned sooner, but was grateful they were finally embracing. The path was far from easy, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead, but I also knew that together we could face them with honesty and courage. And that made all the difference. As I sat in my favorite armchair, the one Lorna had given me for our 20th anniversary, I looked around at the photographs on the mantle, smiles frozen in time, moments of joy and love. The end. Thanks for sticking with me through this story. If you found it meaningful or thought-provoking, please hit the like button and subscribe for more family stories like this. I'd love to hear what you think about the plot. Did the way things unfolded surprise you? Or maybe you've experienced something similar. Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your feedback means a lot and helps me create better stories that connect with you.